This trade war is going to impact literally every corner of the country.
Our farmers will be some of the hardest hit by those triple-digit Chinese tariffs.
We're very concerned, Phil. We have a precedent from the trade war we went through about 7 years ago that was devastating to the American soybean farmer.
In just 60 days, 94% of U.S. soybean exports to China vanished. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Over 30,000 American farmers saw their main export market collapse almost overnight. For many, it wasn't just a trade disruption. It was the unraveling of decades of planning investment and hard-won access to the world's most important agricultural buyer. There was no natural disaster, no historic drought, no major flood. What happened was man-made, and it came from Washington. A trade policy built on confrontation, not coordination, blindsided one of America's most vulnerable communities. Farmers weren't invited to the negotiating table, but they were the first to be sacrificed when tariffs became a political weapon.
And yet here we are watching families be targeted, watched, hunted, farm workers being chased across fields.
On paper, these were just numbers. In reality, they meant empty grain silos, stalled machinery, and families watching their savings disappear. Many producers had counted on Chinese contracts to finance next season's crop. Now they're counting losses instead, losses they didn't cause but are expected to carry. The silence spreading across rural America isn't just about lost sales. It's about lost trust in government, in markets, and in the promise that hard work would be rewarded. These farmers did everything right. They innovated, expanded, and competed globally. But in the end, they were left exposed by a strategy that changed course without warning. And so, from the vast fields of Iowa to the Mississippi Delta, a quiet question hangs in the air. Is anyone still listening to the people this policy left behind? In early 2025, China made it official a full halt on soybean, corn, and wheat imports from the United States. No negotiations, no delays. The decision came down fast, and it hit hard. Instead of revisiting deals or offering phased adjustments, Beijing signed exclusive 5 to 10-year supply contracts with Brazil and Argentina, effectively locking American producers out of the world's fastest-growing grain market. The shift wasn't just symbolic. It was structural. Now, across the American Midwest, grain silos are overflowing. Storage facilities that were once temporary solutions are turning into permanent graveyards for unsold crops. Millions of bushels of soybeans are sitting untouched, deteriorating quietly in the dark. There's no weather event to blame, no foreign blockade, just a collapse of access and no plan B. Soybean prices have now dropped to around $10.40 per bushel, the lowest in nearly 3 years. For many farmers, that figure is below the break-even point. Every truckload they sell means another net loss. And for those who can't sell at all, the cost is invisible but brutal. Spoiled harvests, broken equipment, and the slow decay of once profitable family operations. Globally, the impact is even more alarming. The U.S. share of the global soybean market has dropped from 28% in 2023 to just 24% in 2025. That's not a price dip. That's a geostrategic displacement, a market realignment that may take decades to reverse, if ever. The message from China was clear: they don't just want to diversify, they want to detach, and other countries are watching. Brazil and Argentina didn't just step in as backups. They're becoming the new anchors in global food supply chains, signing long-term state-level deals that Washington didn't see coming. And back home, American farmers are still being told to wait it out. But the silence from the markets is louder than any promise from Washington. Because by the time the system reacts, it may already be too late. The damage didn't stop at the fields. As farmers began losing contracts, they also began losing options. For many, the first to go were the machines, tractors, harvesters. Sprayers sold off at auction not to upgrade but to buy time. A desperate attempt to cover debt, pay for fuel, or just get through another month. And when the machinery goes silent, so does everything around it. In parts of Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, fields that once fed millions lie untouched. Rice isn't planted, barns are half empty, feedlots are quiet. Local grain elevators and rural co-ops have shut their doors, unable to justify operations with no harvests to handle. What used to be reliable rural supply chains, from silos to fertilizer trucks to feed mills, are now being dismantled piece by piece. But this isn't just an economic crisis, it's a mental health crisis. Rural mental health hotlines are reporting a surge in distress calls, many from farmers overwhelmed by losses they couldn't prevent. According to the USDA and Rural Health Services, farmer suicide rates increased by 21% in the first quarter of 2025 alone. These aren't just statistics. They are names in small-town obituaries. They are families broken under the pressure of a market collapse that no one prepared for. Because when the contracts disappeared, so did the safety nets. Washington offered slogans. Rural America needed solutions. The cost of this crisis isn't measured only in dollars and cents. It's being counted in auction signs, empty barns, and phone calls made in the dark. The crisis unfolding across America's farmlands didn't begin with drought. It didn't start with disease, pests, or even bad harvests. It began with decisions made thousands of miles from the fields in government offices, strategy rooms, and press podiums in Washington. For years, farmers were told to be patient, that the trade war with China was just a phase, that tariffs were a smart tactic, a bargaining chip in a grander negotiation, that temporary pain would lead to long-term gain. But behind the speeches and patriotic slogans, something else was happening. America was losing its most important trading partner because it couldn't offer something China needed, most reliability. Policy didn't just shift, it whiplashed. From administration to administration, from headline to headline, the U.S. trade approach grew chaotic, personal, and impossible to predict. One month saw talks of reconciliation, the next saw sweeping new tariffs. These constant reversals didn't just delay negotiations, they destroyed credibility. And China, facing that chaos, decided to walk away for good. Instead of continuing a volatile relationship, Beijing moved to protect its long-term interests. It turned to Brazil and Argentina, not because their grain was cheaper or better, but because their governments offered consistency. No tariff games, no election-driven trade policies. Just contracts delivery and long-term security. In 2025, China finalized 5 to 10-year exclusive supply agreements with those nations, effectively redrawing the global agricultural map. This wasn't just a market shift, it was a structural exit. And the U.S. didn't just lose sales, it lost position, trust, and leverage. America's share in the global soybean market has already dropped from 28% in 2023 to just 24% in 2025. But this number doesn't fully capture what was lost. Because when trade routes are rerouted and infrastructure is built elsewhere, silos, ports, processing centers, rail lines, it's not just a temporary loss, it's a long-term pivot, a permanent replacement. And the hardest truth, there is no compelling reason for China to come back. Not when they've locked in new supply chains, not when they've spent billions to build resilience in other hemispheres, not when American policy is still driven by short-term politics instead of long-term vision. In trade as in trust, when something breaks too many times, it doesn't get rebuilt. It gets replaced. So while Washington debates talking points, the world has already moved on. And in the heartland, the silence isn't just about exports. It's about being left out of the future. The backlash has begun. Across the Midwest, anger is no longer confined to quiet conversations in barns and co-ops. It's now moving through state courts, town halls, and public squares. In recent weeks, at least 12 U.S. states, including Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, and Illinois, have filed lawsuits in federal court accusing the administration of bypassing Congress in its use of executive power to reshape trade policy. The core claim that decisions affecting entire regional economies were made unilaterally without consultation, legislation, or accountability. But the resistance isn't only legal, it's becoming visible and louder. Protests have broken out in rural hubs like Des Moines, Springfield, and Jefferson City. Farmers, ranchers, and co-op workers have gathered carrying signs, some reading simply, "Don't trade our farms away." Others demand a return to long-term market access, not temporary aid. These demonstrations aren't massive in size, but they are powerful in message. Footage of the protests has circulated widely online, drawing attention from both national media and international observers. In a political environment where rural voices are often assumed to align with a single party, these images challenge that narrative. They show division, disillusionment, and defiance. What's emerging is a split within the rural electorate itself. Some communities remain hopeful that Washington can course-correct. Others, however, view the situation as a breach of trust, a pattern of empty promises and reactive policies that have eroded both livelihoods and patience. And increasingly, some are choosing disengagement, fewer campaign signs, fewer political donations, fewer appearances at town halls. This is no longer just about crop prices. It's about whether rural America still believes its voice matters. And with lawsuits piling up, streets filling with protest and silence growing in places where there used to be loyalty, the answer for now is uncertain. In May 2025, the U.S. government announced a $20 billion agricultural aid package. On paper, it was the biggest direct support program since the first waves of the trade war. Officials called it relief. Headlines called it intervention. But for thousands of farmers, those who had already lost contracts, equipment, and future harvests, it felt like a delayed apology for a crisis that shouldn't have happened. The checks arrived, but the markets didn't. Across the Midwest, producers quickly pointed out what the numbers couldn't fix. You can't subsidize a lost trading partner. Payments might cover a season's debt or keep a farm afloat for a few more months, but they don't rebuild long-term supply chains or reopen closed ports. The message was clear: this wasn't about money. It was about access, stability, and trust, all of which had been damaged far more than any one-time package could repair. In response, Washington pointed to new opportunities, trade deals in progress with India, the UK, and several Southeast Asian countries. But those agreements are still being negotiated. The markets are smaller, the logistics are complex, and the timelines are vague. For farmers who once shipped millions of tons of soybeans to China every quarter, the idea of future partners is little comfort when silos are full and contracts are gone. The central problem remains: relief doesn't equal recovery. While policymakers speak of resilience, many in rural America hear it as code for waiting. Waiting for new demand that may never come, waiting for prices to stabilize, waiting for leadership that doesn't treat them like a campaign talking point. And by the time that wait ends, if it ever does, some won't be around to see it. What began in the fields is now rippling across the country. With market access cut and confidence shattered, farmers aren't just harvesting less, they're planting less too. They're holding back on investments. They're delaying equipment upgrades. And more importantly, they're not hiring. In dozens of rural counties, jobs tied to seasonal labor, transport, storage, and processing are vanishing. It's not just that farms are struggling, it's that the entire food supply chain, from seed suppliers to trucking firms to grocery distributors, is slowing down, quietly, methodically, and dangerously. And when rural America stops moving, the entire country feels it. This is no longer just about soybeans. It's about the foundations of food security and economic stability. Because if the people who feed the country no longer believe their government will protect them, then the consequences won't be measured. In crop loss, they'll be measured in political fragmentation, social instability, and permanent economic drift. Rural communities aren't just economic units, they're trust networks. And when those networks collapse, no bailout can rebuild them fast enough. The crisis didn't need to reach this point, but it has. And now the question is no longer about trade or tariffs. It's about whether anyone is still listening. Because if the government won't defend those who grow this nation's food, then who will stand in the fields next season?